I'm telling you, Michael, we could have an entire episode on what you just touched on, which is the shame and the hidden nature of sin when it comes to things like pornography. Drug addiction's very similar as well. Alcohol abuse, similar as well. But there's probably not a more impactful in men's lives thing than shame. Yeah. And I say, because I work so often in the world of recovery, I say this and I mean it. I believe more people die from shame in the recovery community than die from overdoses. Mm-hmm. And people say, well, how can you die from shame? Because it's shame that keeps you from reaching out for help. It's shame that keeps you from saying, I've relapsed. It's shame that keeps you from saying, I'm tempted in this area of my life. It's shame that keeps you from reaching out to a brother or to heaven itself. And I believe that shame, and of course, we are told in the Bible, the antidote to shame is to expose things to the light. And that's I'm not saying, get on social media and announce every, wretched sin that you've ever committed in life. But I'm saying that there comes a point where you need to reveal it to your Father. And there may come a point where you need to reveal it to trusted individuals to join you in prayer. There's power in confession, there's power in prayer, and there's power in repentance. And we know that those all bind together. But that concept of shame, especially among men. Now, look, a lot of these ladies have got it figured out. Not all, but a lot of these ladies have got it figured out. They can get together with somebody who they just met 15 minutes ago and they're sharing their deepest, darkest secrets.
That's my wife.
I felt this way at 14 years old, and I had men were like, how you doing? Good. Okay, move on to the next part. I mean, that's it. We create this like iron, shield around our hearts and around our feelings. And we have to have some trusted people in which we feel comfortable talking about it, because that's how you defeat it. You expose it to the light.
For men chasing purpose over comfort, this is the Intentional Guy Podcast.
There's an old story about a father who sees his son coming home from a long way off. And before the boy can even get the words out, before he can say he's sorry, the father is already running to him. Doesn't wait for him to clean up first, doesn't wait for an apology. The kind of grace is not just a story to my next guest. He spent his whole career standing where most of us never do, in two rooms at once. A courtroom where the law does exactly what it's built to do, and a church where he's watched the same kind of running, that same kind of grace reach men who figure they're already gone too far to come home. So Brett Knight, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thank you very much, Michael. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to get a chance to speak with you and speak with your audience. I'm already fired up and excited. Just a few seconds, before we were able to come on, you and I were able to catch up just for a few seconds, and I'm already fired up about the conversation that we're going to have today, because I believe that your audience is going to walk away feeling more hope in them.
Well, and I hope so. And I think you bring a perspective to us today, because you're working in the courtroom, and then you're also working in the church. And those two worlds don't necessarily always see eye to eye, do they?
No, they do not. And in fact, it's there's a lot of times people look at me and they say, how can you be a criminal defense attorney and a pastor at the same time? How can those two just don't seem to mix? And it's a great invitation for me to begin talking about the gospel and to be talking about grace, because I think they match perfectly. And I often say, well, as a criminal defense attorney, I'm going to oftentimes encounter people on their worst days. And you know what? And sometimes they've made mistakes, and there's consequences to mistakes. That's just the natural order of things. And so that's where I meet a lot of these men, is when they are at this kind of low point. They're in this 10-foot hole. And then I get to walk with them through, and I get to stand beside them and be their advocate. I get to help defend them. I get to help put in the rearview mirror possibly a mistake that they've made, so that they can focus on their future. And I often say, when I'm driving in my truck here in the middle of Tennessee where I live at, I've got this big old windshield, right? And I got this little bitty rearview mirror. And that's kind of how I live life. And that's how I'm often encouraging these men that I encounter in the courtrooms, is that, look, we're trying to take this event and we're trying to move it from the big, windshield and we're trying to put it in that little rearview mirror behind you. And so being able to move and go forward, and then I'll get people nodding their heads, say, yeah, that sounds like what a criminal defense attorney does. And then I'll say, doesn't that sound like God's grace too? Doesn't that sound like how God looks at us and says, let's move on? My grace is sufficient. I've covered this. And I want to move you to this purpose. I want to move you to this calling, the reason that I created you. And so isn't that what ministry work is? And don't they sound a little bit alike when you begin to see it that way?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people want to remove consequences with grace, right?
Yes.
And the truth is that now, can that happen? Yes, my God can do all sorts of different things, right? But reality is you can still have grace and people are still having to suffer the consequences of their actions. And to me, that's also where the growth comes from too, is from the consequences. Because without the consequences, sometimes change can be superficial. You got to feel the burn.
Absolutely. Well, and it's the gospel. It's the gospel message. It's the redemptive story. It's every bit of the Bible from the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis where, Adam and Eve are in the garden and the serpent is tempting. From that point forward to the end of the book of Revelation when Jesus comes triumphant. I mean, all in between there is a story of us messing up, us having consequences for our actions, and a God who brings grace to cover and to redeem us, even in the midst of the consequences of our own actions. And yes, absolutely. We get this extremes on both sides. We get some people who say, you know what, accountability, we should just punish people. And I'm going to tell you, Michael, I'm going to confess here. I had a good preacher friend of mine taught me years ago. He said, confession is good for the soul, though hard on the reputation. So I'll confess here that used to be me. That used to be me. You see, I'm a criminal defense attorney now, and I have been in my own private practice for 11 years. But prior to that, I was a prosecutor for the state of Tennessee where I prosecuted people for criminal conduct. And I truly believed that if you punish people hard enough, they would change the decisions that they were making. And that's how you fix people. That was my true kind of simplistic belief. And I think there are a lot of people who still believe that. I was working primarily in drug task force and things of that nature, wiretaps and complex cases against drugs in our community. And we have a bad drug problem here in our community and just like everywhere else across the country and the world. But I was really trying to fix that problem by punishing people harder and harder. But I realized that it wasn't making the impact that I thought it would because we kept seeing the same thing over and over and over. And I had to get to the point where I understood how grace played into this, how accountability and boundaries and things of that nature played in, and it became more complex, but I actually got to see that the real issues underlying the pain that was underlying drug addiction, that was often the reason people were trying to numb that. I had to begin addressing that, and the punishment could never heal the pain. Punishment's good at changing behavior, but it doesn't do anything for healing. And so that's where grace comes in, and that's where the presence of God comes in, is that healing ability. Because in the end of the day, you can hold people accountable for what they've done, but punishment alone, it can't heal the pain that's helped drive somebody to the place where they are at that moment. Grace and accountability, they're not opposites. That's where we get to the extreme, because some people on the grace side just think, well, it doesn't matter what you do. Let's just all cover by grace and let sin abound. But that's not correct either. Grace and accountability, they're not opposites. They're actually complementary to each other. Grace gives accountability someplace redemptive to land. I say that a lot. And what I mean by that is grace is what the redemptive power of consequences only begins to redeem us when we've put grace into the mix with it.
Well, and I think part of the problem too is a lot of people misunderstand the meaning of word grace, and that what you just touched on it a minute ago, we should just forgive everything, forget everything, and go on. And to me too, mercy and grace, the lines are blurry these days on that. grace is acceptance. Grace is believing everything you hear. It's gotten messed up to the fact we were talking about masculinity before you came on here.
Mhm.
That men, you got both sides of the coin. You got men who think grace is more effeminate, and if I have grace on someone, I'm not, whatever. And then you've got it the other way too, where you feel like to be a man in today's world, you have to be very forgiving, or forgetful of what everyone's doing, and show acceptance for everything that comes your way. I just don't. I think that masculinity is walking strong in your faith, but you have to understand what grace really looks like, and then, like you said, have a balance of how do you apply this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think for men in particular, it becomes complicated because of even in churches, and I'm not talking about any specific church, I'm saying churches in general. And I get to travel
Right.
to lots of churches and speak in lots of churches and be involved with a lot of things. But for a lot of men, they walk into a church and if they're masculine men, the men, and I don't mean that in a toxic way. I mean that in the way God designed us to be, the way the person he designed us to be. We walk into churches and we don't find anything familiar for us. We see things that are highly emotional driven, and very effeminate in the sense of how things are conducted. And then the churches often say, well, Brett, why can't we get more men involved? I'm like, well, you haven't made them feel very welcome here in the sense of being who they truly are. You've asked them to either change their masculinity and their masculine nature and exchange that for a more feminine nature, or else they don't really fit in here. And that is, it begins with, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It begins with understanding grace, because we don't throw grace out the window, but we don't apply it in a way that's contrary to the way Bible teaches it and the way that we as men should be. And accountability asks us to face what we've done. And we should never lose sight of that. And in some places in our world, it's become very unpopular that, we should be accountable and face what we've done. Any person who's ever walked through like a 12-step program or understands the steps within a 12-step program, they understand that there is a point where you face the consequences or you face the actions and you're accountable to the things that you've done in your past. And there's something very healthy about that, about moving forward. But grace reminds us that what we've done it does not tell us who we are. And that's where grace comes in. Accountability is taking responsibility for what I've done. But grace being applied says, but that's not who you are. That's not who you are. You're not your worst mistake. You're not that moment where you did something that you look back on and wish you hadn't. You're not the things that you've moved on from. And that's grace. You're accountable for your actions, but grace says that's not who you are. Your identity is not found in your mistakes. Your identity is found in Christ Jesus and what he has called you to do and the purpose that he has called you for. That's grace. And I'm just going to tell you, that is masculine. That is power. That is a man's road to go. I own it. I own the mistakes that I've made. I've owned that I lost my temper today with my wife and was harsher and more sharp than I should have been with her. I own that. And grace is saying, but that's not who you are. That was just an action that you just did. You are all these things that the Bible says that you are. And then that gives you the power and it gives you the freedom to then walk back into that and say, you know what, honey? I lost my temper this morning and that wasn't about you at all. And I apologize. And I shouldn't talk to you that way. That's what happens when you take both accountability and you understand that grace does not say that's who you are. Because without grace, without that identity, that higher calling that God calls us to as men, there's no reason to go back and fix things. This is just who I am. This is who my dad was. This is who I am. There's no reason to fix it. I can't change it. This is just who I am. That's what it looks like when a man doesn't have grace in his life.
Wow. And you said that really well, because I think we get stuck a lot of times in what our past actions were. And we allow that to create our identity. And then we might have grown up with that too, right? We might have grown up always being told what was wrong with you, that you'll not amount to anything. And just those words haunt us, and we've been trained and raised, and then they become a part of us, and we just take that. And I know for me, I was that guy that I felt like I was the exception. I needed to be punished more than anybody else.
Yeah.
I was the exception to the rules for God's grace. And it really took being accountable was easier for me than accepting grace.
Yeah.
Because
I think for men, it oftentimes is. We can bear the load of accountability sometimes, but to allow God to take that load off of us, that's hard. That's hard.
Man, and it's, for me, it was almost impossible to do. What is something that you could tell us? You probably got stories on a number of stories that you could share with us, but what is something that you could help a guy who maybe is stuck? We're not that worst moment in our life.
Yeah.
And how do you get unstuck?
Yeah, exactly. And the key to being unstuck is to quit moving, first of all, in the direction that you're going, recognizing that. I've had this conversation more than 100 times. That I'll say to somebody who maybe they're either in my conference room because they have some criminal charges and they're asking me to represent them, or they're in my living room because they're having problems with their marriage or other things. And I'll often listen at first where they are, and then I'll say, "Can we agree you're in a hole? You're in a hole. You're in a 10-foot hole." And they'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm in a hole." And I'll say, "Great. Good news for you. I'm a professional ladder builder. I know how to help get people out of holes. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump in that hole. We're going to get some resources thrown down to us from up top. We're going to take those resources and turn them into a ladder. And then we're going to climb out. And along the way, other people who've gotten out of this hole in the past, they're going to give you advice on how to climb that ladder to get to the top. So it's not just me and you in this hole. There's other people at the top of that hole that are giving us advice and telling you how to climb that ladder." I said, "But first step is this: put down the shovel. Put down the shovel, because we're in a 10-foot hole and I'm going to build a 10-foot ladder. If you keep digging, we're going to be in a 20-foot hole with a 10-foot ladder." And so the first step that we do is we stop. We stop whatever it is that we're doing. And then we begin surrounding ourselves. And if you listen to what I just said in that little analogy, we begin to surround ourselves by people who can hold us accountable, who can help us, who have resources available, who can guide us through a path of steps to get out of that hole. But that's the first step. And I think of examples, and just in July, I did a calculation in my office, and this is just in my law practice, not in my ministry or outside in the community. But I did a calculation, and I had assisted in the last 5 years, I had assisted 187 people getting out of the court system or jail and into long-term recovery. So I've walked this walk with literally hundreds of men and women. And so, I think of an example of a young man, and I say young man, I'm 54 years old, but this young man was in his mid-20s, and he was incarcerated. And he had some charges, and he had an addiction problem, and he recognized it, and he knew he needed help. But there's a lot of legal hurdles to go through. And in fact, at one point during his incarceration, he got panicked and he tried to run out of a courtroom, and they had to drag him back in and all of this.
Never a good idea.
No, it's not a good idea. That doesn't make a good impression on the judges or anybody else. But in the end, I got this young man into recovery. Now, I was able to also be a part and to be one of the people that walked with him shoulder to shoulder through this. So for the next year, I got to walk with him a lot of the steps through. And it wasn't easy for him. It was hard for him to understand that he was worthy of all this attention, that he was worthy of being, getting himself on a correct path, that he was worthy to be loved by a woman. He had a fiance at the time. And so there was a lot that was going on in this man's life. But over the course of a year, I watched this amazing transformation begin to take place. But even then, when he got out, it wasn't over, right? He still had to, reintegrate back into the workforce and circles of friends and housing. And he, they had a new baby. that was born not too long after he was out. So, so he had a lot of life challenges, and I was able to continue walking with him through it. But I'll tell you how so transformed this was. When I met this man, he was in jail. And grace began to peel away layer after layer off of this man to reveal who he was called to be and that he was worthy. He was called by God to be this person, this man of a home, this man who leads a home, this man who leads his wife and now his young child, this man who's in the community, this man who's working in a workplace. And when he and his wife had their baby, they had it scheduled. And on their way to the hospital, she insisted that they stop by my law office on the way to the hospital to have a baby because she wanted me to pray. So she went in the office and she asked for me, and I was still in court. My assistant, she said, well, he's still in court. And she's like, well, I wanted him to pray over me before I went to the hospital to have this child. And my assistant's like, oh, I'll pray over you. I got this handled. We don't have to have him. But that is the transformative power. This man who didn't trust people, who didn't trust that he deserved anything. He was willing to take the punishment, the accountability, but he struggled with that grace. But yet here this man is now walking with the Lord in power, taking on the responsibility of a man in his home and in his community, in his workplace. And it's just wonderful to see. And that's just one example of how we can do this. I challenged him about halfway through his walk, and I've challenged lots of men and women along the way. And sometimes I can be very hard. I can be a very direct person, but sometimes we need that, like that splash of cold water. And so when I get somebody who's particularly persistent in saying, well, I just don't deserve that, and you just don't know what I've done, and you just don't understand. I have two statements. First is when somebody says to me, you just don't know what I've done, Pastor. You don't know. You wouldn't think that I was going to be forgiven so easily if you knew what I did. And I always stop them. I never ask them what they've done. I don't fall into that. I say, well, let me ask you a question. And I'm like dead serious. I'll say, have you ever gone into a church, drug women and children out and killed them? And they'll look at me with the strangest look on their face and they'll say, well, no. I'm like, well, you're fine then, because the Apostle Paul did that. And he was still used by God. So I know you're not beyond the limit if you haven't done that. And then, so I always use that as my example. And then when it comes to the identity that they're walking in, and when they want to say, I just don't know that I'm blessed and highly favored. I just don't know that I'm called to be this. And I'll stop and say, do you think you know more than God does? Because really what you're saying right now is God's word says that you are these things. And you're telling me that you don't believe that, you believe you know more than God does. If God has called you that you are these things, man of God, then you are these things. And you need to recognize that your belief that you're not worthy of it is not from God. And so that's a stronghold we need to tear down, because that's how I read my Bible. You are the things that God says that you are. And to think otherwise is to say, I know more about me than God does. And I promise we don't. We don't. When he's called us to these higher purposes, when he's called us to these things and to accomplish these mighty tasks as men, he knows that we are both capable of doing that with his help and his provisioning, and that we are supposed to do that. And so that's my encouragement to men. Regardless of what you have done, you have not gone too far. And regardless of that little whispering in your ear that you're not good enough to achieve the calling that God says he has called you to, God knows better. He knows better, and we just need to lean into that.
Man, and listening to you, I caught a few things. One, first off, men, this is so foreign for us to apply to ourselves, right? Especially learned behaviors are so hard to change. But we're not the sum of who we are. But it requires action to get out of it. And like you said, you got to stop digging first, right? But I think one of the most powerful part is you need someone to jump in that hole with you and allow them to help you. And one of the most powerful things that I found in my journey was when I finally started trusting someone else and realizing I can't do this alone, and not trusted blindly. I let God bring the right person into my life, right? And then it's been through the men I've placed in my life that then this whole world how I saw myself started changing, because I started surrounding myself with the right guys. And I told you earlier, before we started, I worked at a prison as a transition teacher. And I would see guys come in, and one guy, he come in, you remember me? I've taken your class twice. Well, if you've taken my class twice, that means you've gotten released from prison twice. And so now you're going back out the third time. What are you doing wrong? Every time he'd leave prison, he'd go right back to the same place he got in trouble at, hang around with the same people who he got in trouble with, and he changed nothing. And he just kept doing it. And I remember saying, so do you think now you might be ready to change some of those things? And it was like a light bulb came on him. And, he was having to do the calculation in his head. Is this man right? We keep doing these same things over and over again. And for me, it was trusting, putting the right people in my life, other men in my life that emulated what I was looking for, that had the same goals, the same things, even things that were very foreign to me that I didn't think I could do, right? Like, I'll be honest with you, one of them is being the spiritual leader of my house. I feel so unqualified for that. And the enemy has my ear, right? But I have men in my life who know that, and they challenge me on that, and they encourage me on that, so that I don't believe the lie that is being whispered to me that I'm not the spiritual leader of my house.
That's right.
And I've got them saying, and the other, Mike, don't listen to that lie, because you have been called by God to do that.
Man, I hope somebody out there is just hearing what you just said, because that is it. That's the key. We've got to surround ourselves by godly men. We've got to, I often say, and I read this, and I know it's true, we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Choose your circle wisely. It is one of the top 3 things when people integrate back into the community that will be a stumbling block for them. And that's key. And even like in my analogy of the person in the hole and the ladder that I've used so many times, oftentimes when men and women at the end of, like, say they've been in a year-long recovery program and I've walked with them this whole year, I always wait till the end, till when they're graduating, and I say, you remember that story when I told you about being in the hole? And they're like, yeah, I remember that. And we built a ladder. I said, that's right. I said, now your role has changed. You need to be one of the men at the top of that hole, handing down the supplies and giving the advice on how to walk up the ladder. And eventually you need to get to a place where you're jumping into the hole, because I'm about building an army. I'm about building an army of people to go and to rescue people out of burning fires, and pull out just one more. And in order to do that, I need good men at the top of this hole who are handing down resources, who are handing down advice, who are telling that man how to climb that ladder. And that needs to be you now, because I have seen a correlation between when men, especially men, have gone through recovery and through active addiction, and they moved on beyond that, that if you stay active, involved in helping someone else, you will stay on the right path. And oftentimes, if you don't, if you walk away from the meetings, the groups, the people, the opportunity to help a brother who is maybe where you were at one day, the ability to slip is so much easier. So becoming involved and not just surrounding yourself with good, godly men, but also being one of those good, godly men, being one of those men who carries their friend on a blanket and tears the roof off of a house and lowers them down to the presence of Jesus. That's the kind of men I want to be around, where they're like, we're going to tear a roof off of a house if we need to, we're going to get this done. Those are the men that I like to be around.
Yeah. And you know what I learned, what it took to be that man, was to make a choice. To be him. To make the choice, say, okay, I'm going to do it, because we're already telling you guys how to do this, how we did it, right? So now it's just a matter of, okay, I need to go find my 5. I need to go find those, because I teach that all the time. I coach men, and it's like, you're the sum of the 5 people you hang with, right? And I love what you
have to be intentional. I love the name of your podcast, because that word intentional has just been everywhere in my ministry the last several weeks. But you have to be intentional. You can't just randomly let the world just slide 5 people to you and be like, well, these are the guys I happen to work next to, or these are the guys I went to high school with, or whatever. I'm like, no, I'm intentional. I'm prayerful. I'm saying, Lord, expose to me who my 5 men are, and separate me from the ones that aren't. Don't let them distract me. Years ago, I read a management book, and one of the concepts within it was that good is the enemy of great. And the idea was that sometimes good things can just simply distract us from great things. And so sometimes we have to pray, look, Lord, I know that's a good guy, but he may not be one of my great guys. He may not be one of my mighty warriors. He may not be, one of those people. And so let me know the difference between them and focus your time on those great men that you're surrounding yourself with.
I agree. You have to rely on the supernatural power of God sometimes in your life to lead you, right? Or where's your faith if you don't do that?
That's right.
And I can't sit here. I don't know your heart. I don't know the man next to my heart. And it's funny, the men who God has placed in my life who have had the most impact on my life are not men I would have chose.
Yeah.
I hate to, I'm from Chicago. I was this preacher kid, and one of my best friends is this guy from California who was raised up in a gang, tough dude, all this stuff. I was a guy he stuck in a locker after giving a wedgie at school. And now me and him are best friends, and we hold each other's ladders for each other. So it's amazing that who God puts in my life, it's never who I do. So what I've learned is that my choices are not always God's choices.
No, so, I think as men, we all understand that my choices are not the best choices, not spiritually. They may satisfy a fleshly desire or a level of comfort, but every man who's ever lifted a weight or ran knows that we do not develop muscles in comfort. We do not develop muscles in comfort. We have to stretch and tear, and then what gets rebuilt back is stronger. And that's how we as men have to be spiritually as well. And I'll also add to your thought of, it's not always who I would choose. God places people in my path, the people in my inner circle, they're very different from me. Just like what you had described. I would often look. We all like people who are like us. We really do, because they're like a mirror of us. And we don't like anybody better than we like ourselves. I mean, truth be told, so we look around and it's easy to create an echo chamber where everything I say is just being repeated right back to me. Every decision I make is being repeated back to me. Well, that's not the kind of accountability that makes us grow, because we have to get out of that comfort and we have to be challenged. We have to have those people who are bold enough to stand up and say, no, hey, I don't know about that, bro. You've been acting a little bit strange lately. What's going on with you? And when I say, oh, no, I'm fine, they don't take that as an answer. But those men often look very different backgrounds, different personalities, different age groups, so I would challenge the men in your audience to, take a good intentional look at your closest people and prayerfully seek the Lord in discernment to understand, these may be great people. It's not a critique of the people to say God's calling other kinds of people into my life. These are the people that are meant to change you and challenge you and to make you grow towards your purpose. So they're not always just good guys. Sometimes they can be a little rough around the edges. And in fact, for me, I'll just tell you, I'm a hard person to confront at times. I'm a lawyer. I'm a city judge. I'm a pastor. There's a lot of people that when they first meet me, they don't really want to disagree with me. I mean, it takes a level of boldness to be able to pull me aside and say, hey, I think you're off on this. I think you need to do this. And so I need those bold men around me. I need those men that they'll pull me aside, because if they don't, and here's the other thing I'll add to that, and it's the other side of the coin. Just because other people have an opinion of you and what you should be doing does not mean you have to entertain it. Yeah. If they are not one of those people that God has placed into your inner circle, then you don't have to listen to that. I speak a lot in public. I'm on a lot of social media and videos and things of that nature. Well, along with that comes a lot of criticism along the way. And I have just learned that if you are not one of the men that I would go to ask advice, you really don't get to speak in my life in a negative way either.
Yeah.
So while there are certain people that if they speak into my life, I'll put the brakes on the train and stop, because they're those kind of men that if they say, now hang on a minute, I want you to think about this. I'm not sure you're on the right path. I'll go, okay, let me stop. Let me pray about this. Let me ponder this. That man's in a place in my life where he gets to do that. He gets to throw the brake on things. But that doesn't mean that the entire public gets to throw the brake on things, because otherwise we live in this very dissenting world, and you could find yourself constantly being told, go left, go right. We have an enemy who loves nothing more than to distract us. If he can't defeat us, he'll distract us. So I'll also caution the men to say, get yourself that group of people, allow them the authority to speak into your life. But that doesn't mean that everybody gets that authority to speak into your life.
Exactly. Especially when we live in a world with the social media. We have so many keyboard warriors today.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'll be honest, there was a season in my life where I was just getting offended by all. And then I'm like, my wife was the one, she's like, why do you even care what they think? And she's like, I mean, you need to care what I think about you. You need to care what kids. And I was like, she's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some godly wisdom coming there.
And so I've had some of the men in my top 5 really bruise my ego a few times.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, iron sharpens iron. There's going to be friction. You're going to not always like what they say.
There's going to be some sparks every now and then.
No. And I've had those conversations, and then I've had to contact them back and say, okay, you were right. I thank you for that. But I've also had times where they only maybe have all the part of the information. And so those conversations, I got to give them more information, and then they're like, okay. And I'm good with that because they're only watching out for me. Right.
That's right.
And then, you know what I know? They're like, well, good. Now I know how to pray for you better. Because I just don't want these men talking to me. I want them praying for me too.
Yeah.
And I think another important thing is I want to be back to them what they are to me. Like you said a minute ago, be the guy at the top and work your way to being the guy jumping in the hole with them. Don't just be someone who takes. You need to learn to give. Get outside of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say the same thing. The people who are in that inner circle of me every day, multiple times a day, I have people sending me a text saying, hey, I'm at work and I'm the manager and I got to go have this really tough conversation with one of my employees. And I really want them to see, even though I'm disciplining them, I want them to see God's love coming out of me. Pray for me that I have the right words and the right posture. And I'll stop right then and I'll pray for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, got you, and then there's times where, I'm walking into a really tough situation. I'm walking into a living room and we're about to have a conversation with a man who's been in active addiction for 25 years. And I'm meeting with him about getting help. And I'm like, look, guys, I'm walking into the enemy's territory right now. We're going to come in here and I need some, I need some words of wisdom from the Lord of what to say that reaches into this man's heart and words of life and words of love. And so they'll pray for me when I'm walking into those scenarios. And honestly, I don't know anymore how I would do life, Michael. I don't know how I would do life if I didn't have these people who are my own wife included, who were praying for me in all situations and knowing what I'm involved in. And so if they're going to pray for you in all situations, that means you got to kind of open up the door and let them in.
That's right.
You got to say, hey, I'm struggling with this anger thing. Hey, I'm struggling with this, getting online and, online gambling thing, or I'm struggling with this. Every time I get on Facebook, I'm being presented with these images of half naked women. And that's really causing a problem for me in my walk. And I'm really having a problem with this or that. You've got to be able to let some people in if you want them to really, pray for you. Nothing wrong with, sometimes I'll see people say unspoken prayer request. But you need some people that you can have some spoken prayer requests. You need some people that they can pray for that. I'm not a fan of me incorporating that unspoken prayer request. If I want somebody to pray for them, I want them to pray power into this very specific thing in my life, which means I have to humble myself in order to be able to talk about it. And I think that's a requirement for me into that. So,
well, I grew up a pastor's kid, and so my world was superficial in that type of relationship. I went through where I'm praying for you was like, have a good day.
Right. Yes.
And so a lot of people that in the world that I grew up with, they didn't really, it was the unspoken prayer request. I found myself where I did not have these men that I were having these honest conversations with saying, hey, I'm struggling with pornography right now. And I need help. I need you to dive in. That's shameful. But I want to be in relationships like that where I can say that to someone.
That's right.
Because in those moments, I know I have 5 guys. I've got men in my life right now that I know and I feel it. When I ask for prayer, they're
Yeah.
praying.
They do it. I made a commitment to myself, and this is probably 4 years ago. I noticed like on social media, people are like praying for you, praying for you, and that kind of, that I wouldn't even type in the words. And I'm not trying to be religious or, a Pharisee here, but I wouldn't even type in the words praying for you or I'll pray for you until I had actually stopped for a moment and prayed for them and then typed it in. And then I'd say, I prayed for you, because I didn't want to get to a place where I was just simply using those words, I'm praying for you, without the power, because me saying it doesn't mean nothing. No. It's the power of reaching the Heavenly Father and calling down all of heaven into a situation. That's what it means when it says, I'm praying for you. So when I'm saying I'm praying for somebody, I sincerely mean it. And I'm telling you, Michael, we could have an entire episode on what you just touched on, which is the shame and the hidden nature of sin when it comes to things like pornography. Drug addiction's very similar as well. Alcohol abuse, similar as well. But there's probably not a more impactful in men's lives thing than shame. Yep. And I say, because I work so often in the world of recovery, I say this and I mean it. I believe more people die from shame in the recovery community than die from overdoses. And people say, well, how can you die from shame? Because it's shame that keeps you from reaching out for help. Yep. It's shame that keeps you from saying, I've relapsed. It's shame that keeps you from saying, I'm tempted in this area of my life. It's shame that keeps you from reaching out to a brother or to heaven itself. And I believe that shame, and of course, we are told in the Bible, the antidote to shame is to expose things to the light. And that's part, I'm not saying, get on social media and announce every, wretched sin that you've ever committed in life. But I'm saying that there comes a point where you need to reveal it to your Father. And there may come a point where you need to reveal it to trusted individuals to join you in prayer. There's power in confession, there's power in prayer, and there's power in repentance. And we know that those all bind together. But that concept of shame, especially among men. Now, look, a lot of these ladies have got it figured out. Not all, but a lot of these ladies have got it figured out. They can get together with somebody who they just met 15 minutes ago and they're sharing their deepest, darkest secrets.
That's my wife.
I felt this way at 14 years old, and I had men were like, how you doing? Good.
Yep.
Okay, move on to the next part. I mean, that's it. We create this like iron, shield around our hearts and around our feelings. And we have to have some trusted people in which we feel comfortable talking about it, because that's how you defeat it. You expose it to the light, and
That's exactly right. And that's the only way to defeat shame is to expose it. Because usually we've made it worse. The lie inside of us is exaggerating it more than what it is. And, like you said, you've met with a lot of people who say, you don't know what I've done. You don't know what I've done. And I've said that a few times in my life. Mm-hmm. So I can relate. Hey, let me ask you real quick. One of the things I've done, I didn't used to be a reader. Men, we don't like to read a lot. And now, I commit to so many books a year that I try to read to better myself. If someone asks me, how can I better myself? I'm always telling them, well, when's the last time you picked up a book? Right. Mm-hmm. And most time men can't tell me a book they've read.
Yeah.
And I know you wrote one. Would you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I finished and published a book in the end of May. So it's still a recent out. And the name of the book is From the Gavel to Grace. And it's about walking people through what recovery looks like. But it's a field manual. I'm just going to say it's a field manual for people who are walking out of active addiction into recovery and those that love them. And so a lot of the time I was really in the mind of a mother, a mother who's been setting up until 2:00 in the morning, worried about her son, praying that he gets arrested, because then at least she would know he was alive.
Right.
And so I think about those conversations, those mindsets. And so I wrote this book, and there were a couple catalysts that actually began this. I never set out to be an author, but it became in my path. And that was that, you can't punish pain away. I touched on that a little bit earlier, how, you have to get to the root cause of what this issue is. And then it was also trying to help parents and loved ones and husbands and wives to understand what it is that their loved one is going through. I get those questions so often, hundreds of times. I've had that conversation of why do they do this? Why don't they just quit? Why don't they just stop? They came home on Thanksgiving and they blew the whole situation up. Are they mad at me? Is this because of something I did as a mother? And to go through the thought process and the decision making, derailing that addiction can cause for people, and then to also walk families through how do you help somebody and give hope to people who are trying to go into recovery. And then the last third of the book is really dedicated to the community and to churches, trying to light a fire under us that, you know what? We really need to start walking this. We really need to start getting involved in this. Hey, you quoted the story from the prodigal son at the very beginning of this episode. I use that story at the end of my book to explain what love and the grace of how God sees us, no matter how long we were in the pig pen. But he doesn't go to the pig pen and fund our sin, right? The Father didn't go to the pig pen and fund the sin. He waited for that. But as soon as the first steps were taken there, he rushed to meet him. And so there's a lot of that. It's that conversation of what hope looks like. It's filled with all kinds of testimonies. I think there's 12 or 13 real examples. I'll talk about an issue. I'll talk what the Bible says about that issue, and then I give like a true life testimony walking through that. And having helped hundreds of people walk through it, I had a whole, file cabinet full of examples, and then I actually had those people write their own testimonies of how it impacts in that book. So it's been, I'll tell you, I wrote it, and the reason I wrote it is I knew that these conversations like you and I are having, families are literally dying, communities are literally dying for this information.
Yeah.
And I can only meet with so many people in my living room and so many people in my conference room. So I knew something like a book, something like a podcast, that is able to reach people who I'll never meet. And I'm able to share this information, able to share all of this hope, share this idea that loved one is still in there. And there's a God that will redeem them fully. And to share that with people who I'll never meet. And so that's the reason for the book. When it came out, I've been absolutely floored the last 2.5 months, not quite 2.5 months, a little over 2 months, with the response. It came out in the first few weeks. It went on to be the number one Amazon new release book. It's been purchased many, many more times than I ever thought a book that I wrote about recovery would be. It's gone into places that I never even imagined. There are 16 counties in the middle part of Tennessee that have taken this book and purchased like 20 or 30 copies of the book and put it into their jail libraries for people who are incarcerated to read. I have ministries from other states reaching out to me saying, hey, we've read this and we're going to start a ministry. I had a recovery program that read my book, and they took it on themselves and they began to write a study manual for it so they could use it as part of their studies. And they've since given that to me and asked me to refine it and to create a study manual off the book. So there's all kinds of things where God just simply took my obedience. And that's my encouragement to men out there. If you believe God is asking you to do something, just be obedient. He'll worry about the provisioning. He'll worry about making it expand. You just have to be obedient. And so I've had this amazing experience the last few months with this book, the doors that have been opened up. And so I would encourage anybody who has an interest in understanding a lot of what we've been talking about, get a copy of the book. You can get it on Amazon, hardback version, paperback version, audiobook version, Kindle version. Michael, if they had a carrier pigeon version, I would have got that one too, but they didn't have a carrier pigeon version. So and also, if anybody has additional questions about or additional information about the book, my website is brettknight.com, just like my name, and BRETTKNIGHT. And I've got, I think, 12 new articles that I've written since the book's come out, talking about expanding on some of these topics. And they're all on there on the website, and you can go on there and find other information. But most importantly, you can also reach out to me because I really want to hear what people have to say about the book. Tell me if it made an impact. Tell me what made an impact in your life. I had a lady contact me about 3 weeks ago, and she sent me a message on Messenger, on Facebook Messenger, and I know her. And she said, Pastor Brett, and she quoted a line from the book. She said, this absolutely, it put words into my soul that I've been struggling with for months. She said, this is exactly how I felt. And you know what was interesting, Michael? When she quoted that one sentence, I don't remember writing that one sentence. I don't. I mean, it was just one sentence in the middle of a conversation that was a really an important part. But I don't remember I wrote it, but I don't remember toiling over that one sentence. Mm-hmm. But that's what the Holy Spirit does for us. Right. You know, God knew. God knew when I was writing it to tell that this particular words would make an impact in his daughter's life. Yep. And so that's what we get to be when we are obedient. We get to see God take something that we don't even remember and turn it into something. So that's been the book experience. And like I said, I encourage anybody if you know somebody who's in that position and the book may be of help to them, to get them a copy and hopefully it continues to bless them.
Well, I thank you, Brett, for that. I'll be getting a copy. I work with Celebrate Recovery here in Pensacola, and
amazing program.
Life changing.
Absolutely.
And got a couple of guys in there that would probably love to read with it. So that I'm encouraging. But thank you. We'll make sure that we have in the description exactly where you can find Brett at and his book. And if you've been listening to this and you feel like that prodigal son, maybe this episode was just for you. You feel like, if someone only knew me, and maybe the things we talked about are just really scary for you to do. We understand that. Been there, done that. But let me tell you, God has a purpose and a plan. So my words of encouragement to you would be replay this again. And get with a pastor in your area, reach out to a minister, reach out to a Celebrate Recovery, something, or reach out to Brett or I through the podcast here. We'd love to talk with you. And to my guests, until next time, you just keep being intentional. Thank you, guys.